Thank you for attending today's Engaging Networks Plus webinar. I'm John Simitowski, the sales engineer for Engaging Networks. I'm joined today by Ben Childers, our Director of Account Services. In this webinar series, we show you how to make the best use of your Engaging Networks account. Today's session is the science of peer-to-peer fundraising. We'll be joined by two experts, Katrina Van Huss and Otis Fulton of Turnkey Peer-to-Peer. Turnkey is a partner agency located in Richmond, Virginia, that helps clients understand the motivations of peer-to-peer fundraising participants and donors and crafts campaigns to increase recruitment, fundraising, and mission delivery. Before we turn it over to Katrina and Otis, I want to add some context with a brief description of the peer-to-peer fundraising module in Engaging Networks. It's a little history for peer-to-peer fundraising in Engaging Networks. We had an initial module, which we've since retired. Our current module was co-developed with our friends at the Zuri Group. We initially called this module Amplify, but we since retired the Amplify name, thinking it was a little confusing to have a brand within a brand. Now we simply call the module Peer-to-Peer. We initially built this module for DIY peer-to-peer fundraising. Do-it-yourself fundraising can include things like where your supporter is running a marathon on your behalf, wants to raise money for your organization. You can also use it for honor or memorial sites, Day of Giving, Giving Tuesday, anything of that nature. Peer-to-peer is now a very mature product, now in release 3.3 with the events style site. Events includes things like registration types. So if you're doing a walk event, you could have one registration type for walkers, another for volunteers, and another for a virtual option. You can also charge registration fees, although Katrina and Otis are going to have something to say about registration fees for peer-to-peer events in just a moment. And also event activities. Event activities is a new feature we developed at the request of our friends at Big Brothers Big Sisters of America. With the Bowl for Kids' Sake program that BBBSA runs, they take over a bowling alley for a weekend and then allow the supporters to select a bowling lane and a bowling time that they wish to participate. So all built into the event activities. You can customize that any way you like. The peer-to-peer module uses all the other features of Engaging Networks, including all of your current Engaging Networks supporter records. So no worries about having yet another system all built into your Engaging Networks account. No worries about duplicate records. It also uses our query builder tools, profiles, and most importantly, marketing automation, which is going to be a lot of what Katrina and Otis are going to talk about today. So peer-to-peer site types do include the DIY model. Within the DIY model, you can have multiple campaigns. So a single website can have multiple different giving purposes or campaigns. Could be an evergreen campaign for honor memorial sites. Could also do seasonal campaigns within that as well. Your fundraisers who participate in your DIY site can have multiple pages, so they can participate in many of those campaigns at once or at different times of the year. Common uses for DIY include DIY fundraising events, where your supporter is doing some other event on your behalf, symbolic giving, honor memorial, crowdfunding, and Day of Giving. The event style site can include multiple participant types. You can do paid or free registrations and discounts with that as well to motivate people to register early. You can specify locations and start and end times because this is really for physical events where people are going to show up and participate in person. Common uses include walk, bike, or run events or any type of event that you might host, as well as third-party or invitational events. So when you get started with peer-to-peer, there's some things you need to think about. First of all, what's the concept? What does the event look like? What do people do at the event? Who participates? When is it? Why are you doing this? And how does someone participate? How are you going to implement this? Who's going to configure it, test it, and launch it? Do you have that bandwidth on your team, or do you need the help of the Engaging Network support team, or perhaps of one of our partner agencies? What does the design and content look like? Can you include your own branding and pages? And the answer is yes. We can help you with some of that, and our partner agencies certainly have lots of strengths in those areas. But the key is, what is the strategy to recruit, activate, and manage people, which is a lot of what Katrina and Otis are going to talk about today. But then also consider donor services. So when your supporters need some help, who's designated on your team to provide that? Or perhaps you want to do some webinars to introduce your supporters to the tools. So lots of ways to get started with peer-to-peer. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Katrina and Otis.
we've studied over the years is how do humans make decisions, and we use whatever tools we have. In the old days, the kinds of tools that we had were the telephone, the stage, maybe a human that we could deploy, direct mail. But now we're into this new space where we can actually react to people in a real-time way as long as we can mark their behavior in a database. We can compose and execute what feels very much like a conversation, but it's done digitally, automatically. And that's the beauty of what we're talking about today. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Otis Fulton.
Yes, I am a psychologist, folks, and I study fundraising. What I'm going to talk about today is using behavioral principles in your fundraising campaign. And let me just set expectations first. Will you get the next Ice Bucket Challenge? Probably not. Very, very unlikely. But what you will get by following the principles I'm going to talk about, you're going to get an extra 8% here. You're going to get an extra 12% there. And what we found, our research and others' research have found, is that that really does have a huge impact on your bottom line. So I'd like to start out today by talking about some research that came out last year. This is from the National Awareness, Attitudes, and Usage Study. And what they did was they looked at 98,000 donors who had supported cultural institutions, things like museums, symphonies, those sorts of things. They had been $250 to $2,500 donors for a number of years, and then they stopped donating. And they surveyed these folks, and they asked them why they stopped. And, you know, the very first reason, the biggest reason, was that they weren't acknowledged or thanked for a previous gift. The second was that they weren't asked to donate again. Down there, look at the very bottom, solicitation overreach. They were asked too often. Now, you know, that flies in the face of kind of our natural, what intuitively we might think that people don't like to be asked a lot. But people are much more likely not to continue to support the organization if you just don't ask them again. But the key is you've got to recognize them all along the line. And that's how we motivate volunteers. So what I'm going to start talking about today is the relationships that you've got with your volunteers and why recognition is so important. You know, Turnkey is a recognition company. We use it as a tool in a number of different ways. And this is a picture of the African savannah. This is where 98% of our ancestors lived, and this is where our modern brains evolved in order to survive. And on the African savannah, the biggest factor, whether you survived or not, was sociability, how well you got along with your group. And so humans over the generations became hardwired for sociability. And it turns out that recognition's a major social cue. Recognition told our ancestors that when there were resources to be shared, they would be included, you know, meaning food. So over the generations, our antenna for recognition became very, very finely tuned. You know, that was a theory in psychology for many years. And then, 12, 15 years ago, MRI machines became very easily accessible. And we started putting people in these brain scanners and asking them to do things. And when you put someone in a brain scanner, an MRI machine, and you have them read simple little recognition statements, things like, when I need help, you're someone I can always count on. Just something very simple. The reward pathway that lights up in the brain is the reward pathway that lights up when we eat our favorite food. That tells us something about how fundamental recognition is to our sense of well-being. And, you know, the interesting thing about this is we would expect that from folks who maybe are friends or family member. Being recognized by them would be very rewarding. But it turns out that we have the same response to recognition if the recognition comes from a complete stranger. So, you know, never underestimate that phone call to a supporter or an email. It really does have a big impact. And, you know, we know that people want to be recognized. I can tell you, of the billions of dollars that are donated every year to charity in the United States, far less than 1% of all donations are done anonymously. Yes, people find donating to charities to be very rewarding. There's, you know, the altruism factor and so forth. But people also want others to see them behaving altruistically. And we know from research that people behave more pro-socially, as psychologists say, in public when they're in private. So let's talk a little bit more about the relationships that you've got with your supporters. Psychologists call these social relationships. When you ask someone who's in a social relationship why they do the thing they do, why they support American Cancer Society, for example, they typically say it's things like, it's just the right things to do. It's something that I believe in. And that's exactly where you want to keep your supporters. You want to keep them in these social relationships because they will do things for you over time. It's the kind of support that sustains. But if you're not careful, it's easy to get these relationships off track, and then it's very difficult to get them back on track. I'm going to tell you about a study that was done about 10 years ago. You may have heard of it, got a lot of attention when it came out. It's called the Israeli Daycare Study. And there was a situation, Israel has a system of public daycares, and they were having a big problem with late pickups. On average, they had 25% of parents who were picking up their kids late. And so they worked with the university, and they worked out a program, and they decided to impose a fine. And so for every time you would pick up a child late, it was per child, I believe it was about $3 per child when you came and picked up the kids late. And within 2 weeks, what you might have expected happened, or maybe you didn't expect it. What happened was this: within 2 weeks after the fine was imposed, late pickups had gone up to 40%. And they leveled off, and they stayed that way for about 6 weeks. So after a couple of months, nothing had gotten better. So they went back to the university folks, and they said, well, clearly there have been some unintended consequences here. What should we do? And they said, well, let's stop the fine. And so they announced that there would be no more fine, at which time late pickups went up to 48%. It was almost double what it was when they started out this program. Well, how can we explain this?
Otis?
Yes.
What I'd like to connect some dots on for people, when Otis is talking about the daycare fine for picking up your kid late, the analogy in our world are things like your registration fee, or charging extra to bring your dog, or even charging for food at the event. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, interestingly, the title of this study is "A Fine is a Price," and so all the things that Katrina has mentioned, has a price. They impact the way people see your events. Well, what had happened here is this: people live in two different worlds. They live in a world of social exchanges. I'm going to pick up my kid because it's the right thing to do. And they live in a world of market exchanges. And these two worlds have different norms. And so introducing market norms into the social exchange violated the social norms, and people were able to reframe their social relationship, I'm picking my kid up because it's the right thing to do, into a market relationship. Well, how do we know this? We know this because when the fine was lifted, late pickups increased. Now it became an even better deal to stay half an hour late at the office. People no longer saw it as their social responsibility. They saw it as kind of a market exchange. And we know that when that happens, it's very difficult to get people back into a social relationship. I have a friend at Duke University, Dana Reilly. Let's see if you've got his quote here. Nope, we don't. He says, he has a great quote: "Once you've offered to pay for her delightful Thanksgiving dinner, your mother-in-law will remember the incident for years to come." So violating the social norms with market norms, the market norms trump these social relationships, and it's very difficult to get people back. So think about, do you charge a registration fee? Katrina, do you want to talk a little bit more about that? We see this all the time.
Sure. So, charging a registration fee cues the participant that they're in a market relationship, even if they originally showed up because they were committed to your cause. So you're beginning to transition them at that point. A really good example is with the Blackbaud latest benchmark, peer-to-peer benchmark. They're loosely categorized into social and market relationships. The social relationship is typically exemplified by the walk, which often doesn't have a registration fee, and endurance, which not only has a registration fee but has high required minimum fundraising. Clearly an indicator I'm in a market relationship. But in the very gray, muddy middle is the 5K, which charges a registration fee because there are costs to be covered, but really presumes that many of the runners are mission connected. What happens is those people become unconnected, and that's not universally true. None of our statements here are universally true. You can always find someone who will break the norm, but statistically, what we're doing with a 5K is inspiring a market relationship with none of the benefits of an endurance program with high required minimum fundraising. Go ahead, O.
So, the question is, how do we develop this connection to the organization? Psychologists talk about intrinsic labels or self-labels. It turns out that people who are intrinsically motivated to behave in ways that are going to support your support your organizations, they've labeled themselves. For example, my label, I'm an animal rights supporter. I'm a University of Virginia alumni. People label themselves in a lot of different ways, and then they behave in ways that are consistent with these labels. Some very interesting research around this. It turns out that if I can get you to describe yourself as a chocolate lover, as opposed to someone who loves to eat chocolate, kind of a subtle distinction there, chocolate lover's a noun. The people that say that they're chocolate lovers have a much greater preference for chocolate than the people that are they describe themselves as someone who loves to eat chocolate. So, what we want to do is create opportunities for people to become cancer evangelists or, whatever the evangelist is for your particular cause, because we know that people who consider themselves to be nouns instead of verbs, they have strong intrinsic labels, and these strong labels lead to very strong motivation on part of your organizations. And, how do you get started? Robert Cialdini in his classic book Influence talked about the foot in the door effect. You've got to find some way to get that first behavior, and that's really the biggest trick. There are a lot of ways that you can do it. You can try doing direct response mail to attract people. Blackbaud tells us that the direct response only gets a 0.04% of people to say yes. That's 1 in 2,500 people. So you've got to put out a lot of lines in the water in order to get just 1 in 2,500 people to say yes. Then there's peer-to-peer. And why peer-to-peer is such a tried and true method of getting your foot in the door is this. 25% of people say yes to a peer when they're asked to support an organization or a cause. So let's say you've got these 2 little girls that show up on your door. You know that they live in the neighborhood somewhere. They tell you that. I live over on Witchwood Drive. And we're soliciting funds for the school band or the PTA or whatever it is that they're raising money for. 25% of the time, people are going to say yes to this ask. You're not getting 25%. The peer-to-peer campaign is doing something wrong. Now that's your foot in the door. Did they give money because they're really interested in the school band? No, they didn't. It's because they know that their kids are from the neighborhood and they want to support the kids. And then the trick is to transfer that support to your organization. Now you've got their contact information, and we talk about this. Now they're in this affinity funnel. You've got folks from being unaware of the school band, and now they're aware of it, but they don't have really any affinity to it because they just gave to support the neighborhood kids. And now what we start to do is we start to message them. Do we ask for more money? No, we do not ask for more money. We do things like, would you like a sticker to put on your car that talks about the band? Would you like to put something on Facebook saying I supported the band? Something very, very simple, again, that brings them along this continuum, and eventually we'll ask them to donate after they've gotten more of a label, an intrinsic or a self-label that says, I'm the kind of person that supports my local school band. That's how we develop them from somebody who doesn't even know about the organization to being a real evangelist who will go out and raise funds on the school band's behalf themselves, perhaps.
Otis, this is John. I just wanted to just jump in with a couple of questions that come up in the chat window, mostly around registration fees. Chelsea's asking, what if you need to justify an event to the finance team by having a registration fee? to cover the costs? And if you step into an organization that's been offering premiums, how do you phase out that market relationship? And I think this is definitely something you cover in your book, Dollar Dash, that I've been reading. And it's also, and you use an example from the National MS Society from Betty Ross, one of my friends and mentors, to talk about converting that market relationship to the intrinsic and create that greater affinity. And I know that worked totally for us at the National MS Society. So can you comment a little bit more on that? As how do you justify those things, and then how do you make these conversions?
So I'll take the first question. How do you justify not having a registration fee to a board of directors or to an ED? Because you want to definitively cover cost. And the way that I would do that is with math. When you look at the statistics around people who fundraise in events with registration fees, their fundraising is quite depressed. And really the 5K audience is a good marker for that. So using median and average fundraising from a 5K would give you a good answer. And then you compare that to median and average from a walk. What trips people up is that about only 1 in 8-ish people in a walk who show up actually fundraise up to any significance. But they fundraise so much more that the average is actually much better than a 5K, as an example of something with a registration fee. So it's really developing a different mindset. The other way that I would do it is including more metrics than revenue. If revenue is the only metric, it's still a winner to go with no reg fee and no transactionalism at all. We use reg fee as the easy example, but we see transactionalism installed into events at every point. So it's a way to live. It's a mantra for the event that we are not transactional. If you're here and if you're doing something to support this event, it's because you care, not because you want the bouncy house. So there are lots of points to consider there. But the second thing is the addition of other metrics. Peer-to-peer is one of the few successful donor acquisition tools. And historically, old school is that peer-to-peer acquired donors aren't worth much. That is false. If they're not worth much, it's because we're not handling them successfully. And one of the beautiful pieces of functionality that Engaging Networks has is the ability to go slow. And by that I mean, when Otis talked about the start small, that's going slow. To make a dating analogy, you wouldn't go on your first date and then ask to get married. But that's what we do in nonprofit. You donate to someone in an event, and the next thing you get is a request, depending on how you come out in the wealth screening, is a request for either a little or a lot of money. And that's too much too soon. Engaging Networks marketing automation functionality lets you measure where they are and take the next logical step, which is a little step. It's not a big step. So that's one way I would talk to the board about it. And then the other question was about if you're already in a transactionalized relationship, what do you do? There are two routes. You either start over with a different sub-brand or you try and fix it. Fixing it is hard and requires deep thought and a commitment to changing that. And what you will see is that your audience may turn over because you will lose people who were always transactional or always in a market relationship and have to replace them. Some you can convert. Otis, if you had to start over or convert, knowing what you know now, what would you do?
It's a real problem. I think that I would be in favor of starting over.
With
it just
brand.
It's just clean. We have so many examples here in Richmond. We have something called the Monument Avenue 10K. It benefits the Virginia Commonwealth University Health Center's Massey Cancer Center. No one even knows. I mean, the Massey Cancer Connection is kind of an afterthought. It's very transactional. You've got people that have an affinity for running, not for curing cancer. So I think just to use that as an example, I think it'd be much easier to start a Massey Cancer Walk down Monument Avenue than it would be to try to transition those folks. I think as you say, it's a numbers game. I just think that you'd be ahead in terms of dollars and cents by doing that.
But we also do not recommend stopping the transactional event because it's gaining you data and it's gaining you some exposure, but it's never going to gain you a lot of money, revenue.
No. Running these events, as you say, kind of having two in your portfolio is great. The thing I would caution folks is trying to combine them into one event. We've seen these horrible Frankenstein monsters of walk runs. You really want to have distinct events that are held at different times and different dates.
Yep.
Okay, so we've got people in the funnel. I hope that answered folks' questions. We've got people in this funnel, and we are recognizing them. We're moving them along. And, what's the principle that we're using here? We're really playing on what psychologists call people's consistency bias. They've done one little thing for you. You've got your foot in the door with that peer-to-peer. Now, people want to be consistent in two ways. They want to be consistent in their behaviors over time, and they want to be have consistency between their attitudes and their behaviors. So just the fact that they've made they've said yes to one small request makes it much more likely that they're going to say yes to requests down the road. And it also is the case that because they've done this one behavior, they've given $20. Now they're thinking, gee, the school band must be a pretty good thing. And they may be thinking that consciously or maybe subconscious, but people's attitudes do match up to their behavior. So that first step, you've got a lot going for you now. And now we recognize people. Now, how does recognition strengthen self-labels? Several ways. Just by a personal thank you. I got a call from somebody at Virginia Commonwealth University Alumni Association for a $50 thanking me for a $50 donation, and it was incredibly rewarding. I got off this 5-minute phone call, and I thought that was great. It just kind of proved to me exactly what we talk about, how rewarding these little interactions are. But, when you've got thousands of supporters spread out around the country, it's hard to get everybody on the phone. Another way over here on the right is having folks get up and talk to other volunteers. Katrina, do you want to talk for a minute about the Relay for Life, what they would do with volunteers? You've had a lot of experience with that.
When we talk about ways to imprint or change someone's intrinsic label, how they see themselves, there is no more powerful way. This is the single most powerful way to get someone to believe a thing, is to get them to stand up and say a thing. Because once they do, the psychological pressure to continue along the same path is huge. So Relay for Life was masterful at that in its heyday as it was growing exponentially. Their events were volunteer-led and volunteer-executed for the most part, which meant that there were a lot of people standing up and saying out loud, I believe in this thing. I want you to be with me in this thing. This is what we're going to do. And that was one of the huge driving forces behind the explosive growth of Relay. These people had autonomy, and it put them in front of rooms a lot, reinforcing their attachment. I'll take the next one, too, did you already talk about the bracelet, babe?
No, I have not.
Okay, yeah. So Relay also did that really well. They didn't use expensive things, and that's how I came to know them, is that at that time our company was more focused on product, and that's how we got into this whole thing really, is that we saw the trends in product, and what we saw was that the smaller the product, the better they reacted. And Relay did that really well. They would put a Relay logo on you or in your hand or in your face as much as possible. And that really helped people identify and attach to the brand and stay connected over many years.
Yeah, let me talk about these small gifts that Katrina mentioned. Whenever you give anything to anybody, what we know is that less is more. And in fact, one of the reasons Katrina got into this years ago was the data showed that the better the things that she was giving people, the less they were doing for them. And psychologists call this the less leads to more effect. It's kind of counterintuitive. And here's how it works. Anytime you give somebody an item, something to say thank you, it should provide what psychologists call insufficient justification for what they do for your organization. I'll tell you what that means. Nobody works 20 hours on a weekend parking cars for your event for a T-shirt. Nobody does that. But when you start giving monetary gifts, it makes people think, was this worth my time? Now, they might not say that out loud, but in the back of their mind unconsciously, they're thinking, I got a $35 Target gift card. I was here for 20 hours, that suggests a transaction, and it suggests that, I'm a pretty low-wage worker, which is, again, what we want to avoid. So kind of my three little keys for when we give things to folks: always be branded with the organization. They should be of modest value. In fact, we have a kind of a sliding scale between 4% and 6% of the amount that's raised or donated. And if possible, it should be otherwise unavailable. The great thing about these gifts are that they're exclusive. The only way you can get this T-shirt or whatever it is, or this wristband, is by raising $100. And, that's very important to people, because it really shows that they're part of an exclusive club, even the little wristbands, that they've gotten this for doing something that's very specific. And yet, we see all the time in our clients and other nonprofits that people use the language of the marketplace in order to interact with their supporters. They offer discounts. Register by June 20th and get 25% off. They talk about these incentives, these monetized gifts. Only 2 days and the price goes up. And this really gives people the wrong idea about why they're involved with your organization. Again, we see this all the time. We had someone in a colleague send this to us, raise and win big. Now, this is not the message that this is not going to be building the evangelical psychology behind your supporters that you want. You just don't want to have this kind of transactional language in it. Research study after research study after research study shows that this is counterproductive, and this is actually going to demotivate your supporters. I say all the time, if the research says that giving scooters and blenders would result in a better bottom line for nonprofits, we just get a bigger warehouse. But it just doesn't work that way.
Otis?
Yes.
If you go back to that slide, one thing I'll point out is this is an example that everyone knows about, is Komen. Komen has suffered over the years. What they had was the 5K model. You pay your $35 and you show up and run or walk a certain distance with 25,000 of your closest friends. That was what they were selling, and the language around the race was highly transactionalized. What you'll see rolling out next year with More Than Pink, their new brand, is completely gone. The transactionalism is completely gone. They are excising it, and it's hard from their race series, and that's why you're seeing the More Than Pink sub-brand, and that's why you're seeing a gradual but determined change from the transactionalism. The question that came up early about that $35, the reason it's on the tip of my tongue is because I have it a lot, particularly around Komen, talking to their affiliates and helping them to understand what they're trading for. What's the other side of the fence look like when that $35 or $50 and an extra $5 to bring your dog and another $5 to pick up your packet and another, and it goes on and on and on. So it's a big shift. You'll see it manifest in your neighborhood, I bet, but that is the same thing that we're talking about here. So one of the things that's exciting, and I referenced this early, is that the functionality within Engaging Networks is such that we can be responsive. And the ways that Otis was talking about building an intrinsic label in someone, the barrier to that has been that it's expensive. How do I deploy a human with all the associated cost to call Otis and say, hey, thanks for that $50 donation? Well, they have the equivalent of slave labor in students, and that's how they afford it. But it's still expensive, but it's still worth doing, which tells you it's very, very powerful. The fact that I can create a journey within my peer-to-peer platform that will take different people on different paths according to their level of affinity is huge. That makes it affordable, it makes it quantifiable, it makes it a piece of business intelligence you can take to your board or to your executive director to help justify what you're doing. You also have created the world's best lead list in my mind. Go ahead to the next slide. Engagement scoring is very exciting. I'm a nerd, but this is like killer. So engagement scoring means that you're looking at your audience, and based on their behavior, you're assigning a score to them. Now, why is that meaningful? Well, within peer-to-peer, maybe not as much. But I can tell you the people in middle giving and major giving, they want to know who's most engaged, and they want to compare that list with their wealth screening list to figure out how to spend the very limited time they have calling prospective donors. Likewise, anybody running a race, right, meaning the staff person in charge of a walk or a race, wants to know who's their most engaged team captain. Start at the top of the list of engagement and work your way down, and your time, which is incredibly limited, is better spent. What you're seeing here is one way to score an audience, and what Engaging Networks is doing is basically looking at their behaviors, assigning a score, and then you can react to that. I think this is one of the most important things that is happening to our industry, because staff turnover is such a big deal. This will help with that, because if you're spending your time on the right stuff, your outcomes are better, you have less stress, and you're more effective. So we talk about, what are the different ways to solidify an intrinsic label with communication to the participant. What do we talk about? You can talk about just about anything, but in particular, applauding last year is a big deal. You're reinforcing what they did, reinforcing the label that I have already. You reinforce what you already raised as opposed to what we want you to raise, and that's an interesting nuance that Otis has been studying quite a bit. It's actually more effective in your email communications to send me an email that says, hey, Katrina, great job, you raised $250, and that will help X number of patients achieve whatever. That will be a more effective email in motivating me to fundraise, better than, hey, Katrina, thanks for the $250 you raised, how about hitting $500 today? That doesn't really feed who I am as well as the first way to write it. And then celebrating.
Yeah, let me.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, why don't you let me talk about that for a minute? What Katrina's talking about is research. It's really, I think, very valuable. When you're messaging folks and you're saying, hey, thank you for being part of this year's XYZ walk. First thing it does is it recognizes them with that label that they're a supporter, and then getting into, with your $100, we were able to do this for patients at the hospital. It turns out that people who are persistent, they spend twice as much time thinking about things that they've already accomplished as compared to what they're going to accomplish next. So it really feeds into exactly what people find rewarding. And, as she said, as we try to, quote, push people to the next level, we tend to forget about that sometimes. And it's something we should take time and really emphasize to people what they've already done for us.
So what we're going to do now is show you a couple of sample emails and point out that it's sort of like the just do it tagline. It's just 3 words. Can you imagine how much effort went into those 3 words? Copy's the same way. What we're trying to do is get it smaller all the time and make the points we need to make. What's highlighted here are what I consider some of the most important phrases, and you'll notice they're all about the person getting the email. There's really nothing about us here, us being the nonprofit, because they're already in the choir, right? You're already opted in. They're getting your messaging. We need to talk about them now. This is always a challenging thing for us with clients because everybody wants to talk about the mission a lot. We need to acknowledge the mission, but talk about the person receiving the email, because our job is to install and build an intrinsic label of attachment to your organization. One of the things that's challenging, and at Turnkey, we have two products that go out the door. Well, 3 products. We have strategy, we have product, and we have copy. And we think so much about copy that quite literally the social psychologist, who is Otis, is the last set of eyes on the copy. And what he's looking for are things that will trigger a market relationship, things that are not words that are useless in building the intrinsic label and reinforcing the intrinsic label. So here's another example. Again, it's about them. You'll see that it's a very light touch on the organization and even on the thing the organization addresses. We push as hard as we can on the you. It's about them. So what are some of the things that you can ask people to do to start small and grow attachment, as opposed to you donated last year, so I'm going to ask you to register this year. That's probably not a good plan. What we could ask instead, between the day you donate and the day I'm going to ask you to register, I could ask you for a Facebook post. I could ask you to recruit others. It's probably too fast. I could ask them to publish their story of why they donated. You can also apply the same treatment to participants. The last one, ask them to publish their own story about why they did whatever they did. It's really interesting. What they say is not going to be the reason they did it in all likelihood. For example, if I hit Otis for a donation to my favorite nonprofit, he will give it to me because I will make his life hell if he doesn't. We all know this. So the reason he gave it to me is not because he supports Composters International. He doesn't care about composting. I care. But now that he's done it, if I ask him to say, why did you do it? He's going to say, because I want to keep food scraps out of landfills. And that's where it begins. We help him rewrite his narrative into what we're after.
And I truly don't care about composting, but I can say composting is part of my self-label.
All right, so typical recognition structure. Anything. Did they register? Did they return? Did they activate to fundraising? Yay, you got your first donation. Way to go. You know, we level 7 to 10 levels of fundraising as an individual that we celebrate. As a team, we usually have 5 to 7 levels. And then if we are able to execute team member recruitment, 2 to 3 levels there. And really, we'll do anything. If you sneeze and it's Wednesday, we're going to celebrate you because that's what moves you forward.
Yeah, and just let me say, every one of these levels, you can leverage the consistency bias. You know, recognize what they've done, and just recognizing what they've done is going to be much more likely that they're going to do something else in the future for you.
So we use this as an example of ridiculousness to demonstrate effectiveness. This is arguably the worst promotional product in the universe. It is a plastic blood drop necklace. The blood drops blink and flash. It's cheesy. It's cheap. The little light the night medallions there, flimsy. But it did what we needed it to do. It cost us about $2 to get it into a participant's hands. And what we asked them to do was to register and raise $100 ridiculously early. So 5 months before your event, I want you to register and raise $100, and I will send you this ridiculous, blinky, flashy blood drop necklace. It's not even a good sentence, you know? Did it work? It absolutely worked. What we found was that at the end of the promotion, which was in May for events that started in September, we were $125,000 ahead at that moment. And when we studied the people who got the ridiculous, blinky, flashy blood drop necklace, they were the best performers of everyone else. Now, arguably, you could say, well, those were the people who were already committed, so that's why they did it. Maybe they were committed. Maybe they performed at an even higher percentage because we began to reinforce them early. You know, using an offer like that does two things. We start on the intrinsic labeling, and we have an avenue to do it because they gave us their data. They said, yes, I'm in. And Otis, you want to talk about this one?
Yeah, you know, we had a client a couple of years ago that said, listen, we hear what you're talking about with, we call this behaviorally triggered email campaigns, what Katrina showed you in that diagram. When you do something, you get a certain email. When you raise $100, you get an email saying, this is what we can do with 100, you know, et cetera, et cetera. We've talked a lot about that today. Or, you know, frankly, when people aren't doing anything, we call those stagnation emails. When they haven't done anything, they're going to get an email too. We had a client that said, I'm not sure that this behaviorally triggered email is that big of a deal. Why don't we take one of our groups and we'll just send them the regular newsletters about what we're doing. We'll message them every couple of weeks, talk about the event that's coming up and so forth, but we won't do this behaviorally triggered email for a group of them. And we said, well, you know, listen, it costs more money to do the B-Tech. What do you think would be successful? You know, what's your benchmark for success? And they said, well, you know, if they raise 50% more money, the B-Tech group, than the ones that just get the static messages, then we'll say that that's definitely worthwhile doing the behaviorally triggered email. And what happened was this. The average fundraising for the recognition email group was $413 as opposed to $138 for the ones that just got the static messages. So that's the power, as Katrina was talking about, of having this conversation with your donors. It seems very natural, and it really has a big effect on the bottom line. And I'd like to just kind of finish up this webinar today, because the psychology of it. You know, sometimes I'll do this type of a presentation for a board of directors. I do a lot of speaking to those kinds of groups, and someone will come up and say, gosh, you know, this seems kind of manipulative using psychology. I'm not sure that this is kind of the type of thing that we want to get into. And I always refer them to the work of Daniel Pink. He wrote this book, Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. And in the book, Pink talks about what he says is the 3 pillars of intrinsic motivation. When people are in situations in their work, their home, school, whatever, that they find to be satisfying, researchers find that there are 3 things that they experience. First, they experience autonomy. You know, people want to be self-directed. They experience a sense of competence or mastery. They're getting better at doing something that's important. And third is being part of something bigger than oneself. And, you know, I like to tell people that the research out there says that folks who are involved in 2 or more nonprofits actually have a lower risk of mortality than people who are not involved in nonprofits. And so what I feel like we're doing is we're really opening the door to people getting engaged in what's often the most meaningful part of their lives. So I think it's a win-win to draw people in. So however we can get them into our nonprofits, the research shows that this is going to be something very, very positive for their lives.
The takeaways from today are that people don't do what you think they're going to do at the end of the day. They don't behave as we anticipate, and the way we think about motivating people is often incorrect. You know, we think giving them a $25 Starbucks gift card will make them think that we really care. Well, what it makes them think is that they worked for a number of dollars per hour. So what we encourage people to do is don't try to reward, try to recognize, because they will view reward as pay, and pay is negative. When choosing items, less is more. You know, when we think about pay, it's not just money, it's stuff and experiences. And when we recognize people for what they've done, instead of paying them with items or paying them with a great experience, they will become more attached. We have to avoid market language: sale, reduce, reward, prize, earn, discount. The list goes on and on. Free, terrible word. And last, you know, how do you create warriors and increase value through recognition? Recognition is like the easy button on a human. It works on donors. It works on peer-to-peer fundraisers. It works on staff. It works on everybody. It works on my teenage boys, and nothing works on them. But recognition works. You know, reaffirming what they've done in the same direction as what you want them to do is the path to support. The next slide is just our thank you slide with our contact information, which will be in the PDF that you can grab at any point. As I said, we do strategy and recognition systems. We'd love to talk to you. And at this point, I will turn it back over to John.
Katrina and Otis, thank you so much for your presentation today. This is very insightful, and I want to put in a plug for your book, Dollar Dash. I've been reading that myself, and it is spot on and I'm just nodding my head in agreement with so many of the peer-to-peer events I've run over the years. So I do encourage everyone to locate a copy of that book, and again, we'll have more info about that in the PDF. I just want to just flip through a couple of slides very quickly. Not really going to talk about them, but just to know that the marketing automation tools are in Engaging Networks. There are filters in here based on peer-to-peer performance, along with other factors about the supporter, all the actions they take across your other campaigns too. So if you want to try to find people who have participated in your advocacy campaigns and get them engaged in peer-to-peer fundraising, there's opportunities to do that. With marketing automation, you can create as many different workflows for different topics. You can even trigger those based on survey responses. So in this case, if we sent out an email that said, tell us what you think, a link to a survey, we could then guide our supporter to different actions based on what the response was to a particular question. So here's one we saw earlier. This is triggered on whether they're a site leader or if they're a general volunteer. Any of the identification of the supporter, whether you got that from a registration form or from a form they filled out after the fact or just by making clicks on emails, all of that is possible with marketing automation. So if you're interested in learning more about the Engaging Networks peer-to-peer tools, please contact me, John at engagingnetworks.net. I'll be happy to arrange a demo for you and talk specifically about your needs as an organization. Just to move on to the last slide. So if you have any comments about today's presentation, love to hear back from you at info@engagingnetworks.net. Let's share it with a bit more of us here at Engaging Networks. But just to close, I do want to, again, thank Katrina Van Huss and Otis Fulton from Turnkey Peer-to-Peer for an excellent presentation today and stuff that is so important to consider when you're getting into peer-to-peer or have already managed peer-to-peer events. We will make the PDF download of the slide deck today available in a follow-up email. But Katrina and Otis, thank you so much. Really appreciate the content today and appreciate you being a partner with Engaging Networks.
Well, we appreciate you putting forward a tool that lets us execute our evil plans. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks, everyone, for attending. And again, please share your comments, info@engagingnetworks.net.